So I think we can kick off. Just before I hand over to speakers for their talk, I just want to say hello and welcome everyone to people in the room and to people online. Thanks for coming. This is another one of our colloquiums in a long series now, colloquiums on new work in the concepts of mental health, concepts of health and disease. And this is our penultimate event, and next week we'll be welcoming Cecily Whiteley from the University of Cambridge. So that will again be online and in person, so please do come along on Thursday the 11th if you're available. I want to do a quick thank you to the Salby Foundation for sponsoring these events and our other ongoing program. And I don't think there's much else to say other than this is going to be about a 45-minute to an hour talk. We'll then have a very quick pause and come back for questions after that. So please do just hold all your questions till the end, and there'll be plenty of time for discussion. So now I'm going to hand over to Nicholas Binney and Rik van der Linden.
Yeah, van der Linden, which you like.
Who are going to be talking about health and disease as practical concepts. Thank you very much.
All right, hello everybody. Thank you very much for having us here. We are very grateful. The title of the seminar series is New Work in Concepts of Health and Disease. And I think that's exactly what we've been up to last three and a half years in our research project. So we're very glad to share some insight with you. And I say some insights, but we actually have a lot of topics to discuss today. So this is Nick, my colleague and supervisor, and I'm Rik. We're not the only ones in our team. I will introduce them in a moment. Right. Okay. But this is what we will discuss today. I will give you a brief introduction to our research project, introduce the position that we want to develop. We are developing a pragmatist approach. And then we will dive into three problematic situations. So three different case studies in which we find conceptual issues. So one is osteoporosis, chronic pain, and diagnostic testing. After discussing these three cases, I will demonstrate how we make use of two kinds of frameworks for our analysis. That is Ludwig Fleck's comparative epistemology and conceptual engineering. After that, we hope you're all on board and we will discuss even more topics with you. And hopefully this will give you some food for thought. Okay, so like I said, we're not with just the two of us. It's actually a whole research team. Professor Maartje Schermer as a principal investigator, also Dr. Timo Bolt as a medical historian. And then we also had Floor Haalboom for 1 year working with us. She now has her own research line. And together we did this project and still doing this. The aim of our project is to develop this pragmatist understanding of health and disease. And the goal of that is to stir up the traditional debate a bit, because, well, it seems that we have been in a deadlock for a while. And although we could say that we have definitely progressed in from an academic perspective, one should question to what extent our philosophical accounts really have resulted in progress for medicine also. So that is, did we really solve actual problems? And if you ask us, it hasn't done that much. So the debate has become stuck in this polarization between normativist and naturalist camps. But on the other hand, the way we define health and disease has far-reaching consequences. Crucial decisions such as on the inclusion of clinical trials, treatment regimens for patients, and also the implementation of health policy measures, they all depend on the definitions that are used. And due to medical, technological, and also societal changes, the landscape of health and disease is continuously changing. So therefore, after decades of scholarship, the need for clear definitions has not become any less relevant. So by proposing this and defending this pragmatist position, we hope to refuel the debate, and we aim to bring theory and practice closer together and to take solving real-world problems in medicine as a point of departure. So a pragmatist position entails features such as anti-essentialism. There's no true essence of things. Fallibilism, we can't say we were wrong about things in the past. Conceptual pluralism, there can be various conceptualizations at the same time. And it is also in line with constructivism, yet we need to move beyond the mere descriptive character. We should be able to make statements about what is the best conceptualization given a practical or moral consideration. So we do not adhere to any specific account of pragmatism, and we also do not aim to develop a full-fledged theory of health and disease. But the pragmatist account we propose should be sufficient in balancing between these naturalist and normativist poles. So we should be able to speak of medical facts and distinguish between good and bad observations, while also accepting the view that these facts and observations are made within a network of normatively construed concepts. So instead of proposing an exhaustive account, the goal of our project is rather to develop a conceptual toolbox for analyzing and evaluating conceptual issues in medicine. Right, so like I just mentioned, great, thanks. Like I just mentioned, the pragmatist position also implies that we should abandon the idea of arriving at a monistic single theory or definition of health and disease. Rather, we should aim for conceptual pluralism, which means that we can end up with a variety of different conceptions. And this idea of pluralism is not entirely new to the debate. In recent years, some scholars have already pointed to this, the idea of explicating, specifying, stipulating concepts, but it hasn't made clear how to do this exactly. For example, Halvor Nordby said, well, our health concepts are not analytical. They do not have a fixed meaning, but they can differ between speaker communities. He leans heavily on Wittgenstein's family resemblances here. Peter Schwartz said the clarification of the concept disease is not discovered, but instead is set through explication, leaning on Carnap, obviously. Haverkamp and colleagues argued health concepts are action guiding, so the definition should be specified to the values and goals of the medical practice they are used in. And maybe lastly to mention here is Paul and Scarf, who said, well, concepts are specified in relation to the institutions and are shaped by particular pragmatic, epistemic, and ethical goals. So this new direction is clear, but how to do this is still a question. So in a recent publication by our group, we explicitly proposed for conceptual pluralism and suggested and made some suggestions to continue in this direction. In the core of this paper lies a proposal of assessing definitions in relation to the practical function they need to serve and the context they are used or should be used in. So rather than only testing how well a definition suits the extension that is proposed, what we have been doing for so long by traditional conceptual analysis, we propose to do it a bit differently. And taking this position seriously, it implies that we will eventually end up with a variety of definitions, right? But one concern that is sometimes raised is, will we be able to properly communicate between different medical disciplines, between doctor and patient, between researchers and clinicians, etc. So pluralism clearly does not make things easier, but becoming aware of contextual differences, we may enrich our understanding and improve our practical utility. One question that is hard to answer, though, is what counts as a good definition for the pragmatist, right? So what could justify the use of a specific definition when stating that there may be all kinds of reasons out there? So it seems that this pragmatist position also urges us to think and rethink what we consider to be useful, reasonable, and morally acceptable in medicine. And to answer this question, we cannot just solely stick to the theoretical debate. To understand the impact of definitions on practice and what is considered a good definition, we indeed should investigate definitions in practice. And one way to explore such questions is to use historical approaches. So investigate why changes have been made in definitions or classifications of certain diseases. And looking to this history may give us more insight behind such reasons. And another way to do this is maybe to incorporate empirical work like qualitative studies. An important feature of our research project is that we always start with problematic situations, a term coined by American pragmatist John Dewey. And for Dewey, academic inquiry should always start with the idea of solving a problem experienced in practice. So Nick and I will also now present a couple of different issues that have been going on in medicine. And for each problem, we will briefly explain the problem that is experienced, analyze the underlying conceptual issue, and talk a bit about the solutions that have been proposed. Of course, we don't have the time to go in depth to all these cases, but the goal here is just to show you the fruitfulness of looking to these cases with our pragmatist lens. Okay. So after that, I will explain the two frameworks we use, and hopefully we can discuss more cases after that. Something important to say, so as you already may notice, till this point, I've been primarily talking about definitions of health and disease as an overarching higher order concept. However, in the remainder of this talk, we will talk more about definitions and classifications of this, specific diseases, right? So thus on a mid or low level. And it might help to give you an analogy of a pizza. It's almost dinner time, so pizza sounds nice. Sometimes we speak of defining the boundaries of the pizza, the whole pizza, so the extension or perhaps the nature of health and disease. But in other times, we just want to discuss how the pizza is sliced or in how many pieces it is sliced, right? So we're talking about classification and diagnostic criteria. And sometimes we will just discuss what is the topping of the slices. Some of the pizza slices may be topped quite plainly. Think of a margarita, so the disease or the patient group is quite homogeneous, but other slices have a mix of ingredients. Think of a quattro stagioni. A disease is rather heterogeneous. So in this talk, we will zoom into several case studies, focusing on the conceptualization of particular diseases, but every now and then, we will come back to the question what this says about this overarching concept of disease and health. Okay, let's have a look at the first problematic situation. Nick, go ahead.
Smashing, thanks very much, Rick. Okay, our third problematic situation that I'd like to talk about is the overdiagnosis of osteoporosis. Osteoporosis provides one of the main examples of overdiagnosis. So there's a lot of people who are receiving a diagnosis of osteoporosis who don't then go on to develop a fragility fracture. And it's the diagnosis that they're not benefit to them. So that's that happens a fair amount. And it's a good example to show pragmatic concepts in use in medical practice. And I think it's also a good example to illustrate how focusing on these pragmatic elements helps us address the problems that arise in practice. Now, osteoporosis is defined in a way that many find quite curious. It's a disease of low bone mineral density. Bone mineral density rises in humans from birth to a peak in adulthood around the age of 30, and then falls away again as we age. and in men it's higher, it reaches a higher level than it does in women.
Sorry, if you could speak into the computer a bit more, that would be great.
Oh, I have
The speaker seems to not be picking up.
the speaker's not picking that up. Okay, well,
It is just not as loudly.
right, so I'll have to
Speak loud.
speak loudly into the computer. Okay, thank you. Now, we could, in a way that naturalistic theories like Bors's biostatistical theory suggests, define disease like osteoporosis according to whether your bone mineral density is low for your age and for your sex. So I hope this can hear that. So in effect, if we're looking at an elderly female and you take her bone mineral density, you'd be judging her bone mineral density as low or as normal according to people of her age and of her sex. And if you were doing the same for a young female, you'd be judging her bone mineral density for someone of equivalent to the same age and the same sex. Now, intriguingly, so that's using something that's called a dead score in this compartment. So bone mineral density is paid the same age and the same sex, age-adjusted reference classes. The World Health Organization, intriguingly, doesn't do that. It uses something called a T-score, where you're assessing your bone mineral density against someone of a younger age. So an elderly person with bone mineral density will be evaluated against the average for a young female, which is not naturalistic way of approaching the problem. And as a typical elderly person with a lower bone mineral density than a typical young person, lots of elderly people qualify as having osteoporosis, even though they are typical for their age. And many people, including researchers, suggest that is what produces the overdiagnosis in this field. Does that work? Thank you. Right. Walker and Rogers have produced, I think, quite a nice piece of work, much in line with what we're doing, suggesting that we need to modify our concepts of health and disease, help prevent overdiagnosis. And they suggest a concept they call ODX, which is a combination of naturalistic dysfunction, so like a Borsian vision of what function looks like, combined with a high probability of harm. And in their analysis, osteoporosis, according to the WHO's definition, fails on both counts. It's using the T-score, so it's using the wrong reference class, which isn't naturalistic, so it fails on this count. And also, low bone mineral density doesn't give you enough of a handle on fracture risk to tell you who's going to fracture. So it fails on both counts for them. Yeah. I think that's a very interesting, very good analysis. But if we look at the problem in some historical context, I think the problem looks slightly different and the solution looks slightly different. Thank you, Rick. So, in the 1980s, people developed technology, dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, which they used to assess bone mineral density. They're quite excited about this at the time because that gives you a handle. It allows you to measure something which does correlate to some degree with your fracture risk. So using this technology, they were happy that they could start predicting who was going to fracture before the fracture took place. Quite a nice thing to be able to make an intervention before the fracture took place. Difficulty being they're using age-adjusted reference classes because typically people's bone mineral density falls away as they age. Quite a lot of people who are elderly have a low bone mineral density, quite typically. So if they're using an age-adjusted reference class, that doesn't allow them to track fracture risk as well as they were. So by using the T-score, that allowed them to get some sense of how much someone's bone mineral density had fallen. Thus, sorry.
You're assuming that not all old people with fracture because they're living on.
Well, the age is a better predictor than much of the bone mineral density stuff, but it's helpful to use. We'll see more later on in the talk where people start incorporating many more elements than just bone mineral density into the equation to help improve how we can predict fracture risk. And again, I don't think it's me assuming it's just how to do it.
Before you had a moment ago, have an element for this as well, didn't you?
Yes.
Because,
Sorry to interrupt, but I don't think anyone can hear this online
okay.
unless we go nearer the computer. So if you want to continue this part of the discussion, please do so near the computer.
Should it, yeah?
Yeah, please. Yeah, we'll come back. Thank you. So where were we? Yeah, so the reason they're using the T-score, they're using the comparison to the young reference class, the young female average, is to give them a better handle on risk predictions. That's the purpose of doing it, which I think is interesting because you have naturalistic intuition and pragmatic intuition, which would be pulling in the direction. Right. So it's the suggestion for Walker and Rogers of combining naturalistic and risk prediction together in one definition is perhaps running in is not optimal because if you're trying to marry two different sets of intuitions which might be pulling in opposite directions. Still can't hear it.
Yeah, so I think try and say.
I'll still yeah, so I'm pointing at things. Yeah, this problem, I think this tension between naturalism and pragmatism becomes clearer when you look even more closely at how the WHO defines osteoporosis. They don't just use the young female reference class to judge out with the bone mineral density of elderly females. They also use it to judge the bone mineral density of elderly males. Yeah, so elderly men are compared to young females to judge whether or not you have osteoporosis, which is not only are you not using the right age for your reference class, you're also not using the right sex. Yeah, according to these naturalistic theories. Sorry, Rick, thank you. Yeah, so I'll go over here and shout, I think. So you're not just judging this person against that person, you're judging this person against that person, yeah, which seems strikingly non-naturalistic. But again, if you look at the reasons why people do it, in summary, it appears that the same DXA measured bone mineral density, men and women are approximately the same fracture risk. As such, use of the same database to arrive at the T-score seems reasonable. So what the reason they're using it is because it's your absolute level of bone mineral density, which tracks fracture risk, not how typical or atypical you are for being a man. Yeah, you can be much more atypical as a man and have the same risk of fracture as a woman. Yeah. So what they're doing, they have this ethical intuition that people at the same level of risk should receive the same. And that's right at the core of what they're doing in terms of defining their disease concept. Again, very pragmatic, not particularly naturalistic. Sorry, thanks. So what do we learn from looking at osteoporosis? Young female reference classes is chosen precisely because it helps address the questions of risk and harm. If this is the objective of the ODX, requiring naturalistic reference classes may not be optimal. Current concepts of osteoporosis may produce too much overdiagnosis, and that seems to be true. But that does not mean that a naturalistic reference class should be adopted instead. Pragmatic concepts of harm, prediction, prevention, and ethical concepts of equal risk implies equal care are at the core of contemporary concepts of osteoporosis. And maybe if we're suggesting to use different concepts, we should take that pragmatic bent into close account. And if it conflicts with our naturalistic intuitions, so be it, perhaps. Yeah. We still have 2 slides there, so it's the same thing twice. Okay, back to Rick.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Nick. So the problem I will continue to talk about is that of chronic pain. Is this a symptom or a disease? In the newest edition of the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD-11, chronic pain is now described for the first time as in a separate disease category. And this is in stark contrast with the ICD-10 and all the other editions before that, in which chronic pain was not classified in a systematic way at all, and in which it was still viewed as a symptom or a sign. So in the ICD-11, some types of chronic pain are now described as a disease in its own right. This change from a symptom to a disease is a significant one and is viewed as an important step for the recognition of patients that suffer from pain, which is often difficult to measure objectively. The change in classification is not only a biomedical history of new insights into the disease, but also a social history of emancipation, about profiling patients, about the social development of pain medicine as a specialist medical field, and also about lobbying and ongoing negotiations in the world of policy and management in healthcare. It was not only the work by the International Association for the Studies of Pain, the IASP, but also pioneers such as John Bonica, who founded the first multidisciplinary pain clinic to treat these pain conditions in 1948 already, and the British dame Cicely Saunders, who opened the doors to the first hospice in the world, and also played an important role in this. although the change in conceptualization of chronic pain, and with that also the conceptualization of disease, we might say, is often described as a step towards giving patients with unexplained pain better recognition and to better arrange care for them. But there's actually more to it than that. It is true that because of this earlier Cartesian-like concept of pain that describes pain as a somatosensory signal that is caused by tissue damage or underlying pathology, people that suffer from pain without this have been considered to be mentally ill. However, it is also true that because of this believed causation between pain and pathology and tissue damage, pain clinics in the 80s and 90s were packed with patients that received unnecessary surgery or other unnecessary medical treatment, for example, with opioids. And this is wonderfully described in the work by orthopedic surgeon George Waddell, so I can really recommend to read that. It's only in the late 90s that it became clear that this correlation between pain and physical abnormalities, so for example, low back pain and spine abnormalities such as a herniated disc, is actually very low. So the Cartesian concept of pain has caused much suffering, not only for those who lack detectable pathology, but also for the ones who did show abnormalities. When one has a Cartesian concept of pain, like in the left drawing, it's actually a drawing by Descartes himself, pain without tissue damage cannot be real. It must be all in the mind. But when one has a more multi-dimensional understanding of pain, as in the right picture, the pain emerges in a complex interaction of various biological, psychological, and social aspects. And then pain without tissue damage is suddenly not so ridiculous anymore. In fact, it becomes hard to see why pain was previously so tightly connected to tissue damage. So by changing the concept of pain and that of chronic pain from a mere signal of tissue damage to this multi-dimensional understanding, it is believed that clinicians are now better equipped to explain the suffering of their patients and to direct care more effectively. So allowing for talking about chronic pain as a disease in its own right, however, also says something important about the way we define the higher order concept of disease. Okay, Nick.
Right, so our third little problem here, it's not a particular disease in itself, but rather how one evaluates tests for diseases. And I think that attitudes, ontological attitudes, can be seen to influence quite significantly how we go about evaluating tests and saying whether or not they're good. And particularly in connection to these concepts like sensitivity and specificity. I'm assuming they're quite familiar to people. Yeah, so it's sensitivity being if you've got a disease, the probability you return a positive result, and specificity being if you don't have the disease, the probability you return a negative result. And our attitudes to whether sensitivity and specificity are constants are affected by our philosophical intuitions about the nature of disease, as are the methods that we use to evaluate tests, such as the traditional ones are case control studies, and are they appropriate for evaluating how accurate the test is? I think it's also influenced by our ontological attitudes. And also the interpretation of things called receiver operating characteristic curves, which describe the relationship between effectively between sensitivity and specificity. So how we plot them, how we interpret the results of a ROC curve, I think is again influenced by our underlying intuitions about the character of disease. And I hope to show you that over the next 10 minutes or so. Oh, sorry, yeah, thank you. Right, so first of all, I'll go over here and shout for this. I want to get something out of the way. When people tend to talk about sensitivity and specificity, usually they're talking about the difference between sensitivity and specificity and post-test prediction values. Yeah. So you use sensitivity and specificity along with prevalent accurate post-test prediction values. So this is the population of non-diseased people. This is the population of diseased people, which is smaller. And this is the number of people in this population that test positive. This is the number of people in this population that test positive. You can see that the number of people who test positive are roughly the same size. So if we just have someone who's tested positive, they might be from here,
or they might be from here. However, the specificity of this test is quite high because only a small fraction of this group are testing positive, and the sensitivity of this test is quite high, but only a small fraction of this, sorry, a large fraction of this group is testing positive. So the lesson here is that a small proportion of a large group can be larger than a large proportion of a small group, and this is usually what people are talking about when we're talking about sensitivity and specificity. And I bring it up just to say that not what I'm talking about. Yeah, I'm not doing this at all. What I'm interested in is whether the size in different situations, whether the size of this red circle will get bigger and smaller. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, thank you, Rick. I'll stop on the rapid board. So in effect, still today, lots of people teach students writing articles that sensitivity and specificity are terms used to evaluate a clinical test. And they're independent of the population's interests subjected to the test. Or sensitivity and specificity are key measures of diagnostic accuracy. These measures are intrinsic properties of a test and do not depend on the study population. So there's lots of instances of people saying stuff like that. So in effect, what they're saying is this doesn't happen. Yeah, you don't end up in populations where the specificity is much lower because there's a lot more false positives. Or yeah, you don't end up in this situation where the specificity is a lot higher because you've got many fewer. This doesn't happen according to those ideas. Yeah. Or the sensitivity doesn't change either. Okay, so the idea in those bunch of quotes that just showed was that no matter where you use them, doesn't matter which population, they're the same. Alternatively, here's a bunch of people saying the exact opposite. Measures of accuracy include sensitivity and specificity. Although these measures are often considered fixed properties of a diagnostic test, in reality they are subject to multiple sources of variation, such as the population case mix and the severity of disease in the study. So there's another bunch of people saying roughly the same thing. Yeah. So what are the underlying ontological intuitions about the character of the disease that would motivate those two completely different views about whether tests have fixed sensitivities or not? If sensitivity and specificity are terms, so if they're fixed, like these people say, then everybody who's got the disease and everyone who doesn't, so everyone's just thinking about the sensitivity first. Everyone who's got the disease have the same probability of testing positive. Then it doesn't matter where you get it from. All that matters is they've got the disease or not, and that dictates the probability. That's how the sensitivity could be fixed. Similarly, if it's moving around, if so sensitivity is changing, people with the disease have different probability in different populations. So a heterogeneous population. This is very much to do with interchangeability, homogeneity, or heterogeneity, and therefore not interchangeability. I think that's an underlying intuition that supports that view. So this affects how you would evaluate the test. So the standard traditional ways of assessing sensitivity and specificity using case controls, you get a bunch of cases, people with the disease, and then from somewhere else, you get a bunch of control cases, people without the disease. And you assess the sensitivity in the people with it, specificity with the people without it. You take the sensitivity from here and specificity here, you put them together and call that as the sensitivity and specificity. Yeah. Whether the patient is symptomatic or asymptomatic, febrile or non-febrile, older, young, male or female, what prior testing they've had, close contact or general population screening, beginning or the end of an outbreak, or the clinical history, or many other factors are completely unimportant on that view. If they're constant, none of this stuff matters. All that matters is whether the disease is present. For the sake of time, I'm going to spare you this. But quite a lot of people today are happy that the sensitivity and specificity of the test would vary between asymptomatic population and the symptomatic one. But I often try and run through an example showing we should really also expect sensitivity and specificity to vary in asymptomatic people as well, and in many, for a broad range of factors that are usually not written. But that's just that example. The kind of problem that this produces is one much like this. So this is from an article from the Times of India from about 10 years ago, I think, which looked at, again, the World Health Organization's advice on whether or not to use serological tests for tuberculosis. These, particularly in private practice in India, were very popular. Manufacturers had claimed that they'd done their evaluations and shown that the sensitivity and specificity of these tests were very high. But in practice, people found that they were not. Yeah. One of the reasons for this is the manufacturers were evaluating these tests in very favorable circumstances. And the tests look like they're working very well. If you think that sensitivity and specificity are constants, you go, well, the evaluation's been done, we know that they will work. However, if But the performance of the test vary in different circumstances. Can't maybe rely on those evaluations. So this is I hope that's clear. That's the kind of problem that you encounter, that people generate sensitivity and specificity you can't trust in the situation that you as a doctor want to use them. So the WHO recommended not using them, and India say ban them. It's going on. And in the last few minutes, I hope to do something with rock curves, because I think this is very interesting. People draw their intuitions. So on this little graph here, say this is like blood sugar, and say this is a population of diseased people with, say, diabetes, and this is a population of non-diseased people without diabetes. So the population without diabetes has a lower average blood glucose than the population with diabetes. But there's some overlap, yeah, as there often is with variables. So you have a difficulty, you have a problem to solve. Where exactly do we put the threshold to decide whether the test is positive? If we put it here, that means the test will be very sensitive because we will capture all the people with the disease, but it will also lose quite a lot of specificity because we'll also capture plenty of people without it. However, if we put the threshold here, we will leave out all the people without the disease, the test is very specific, but we'll also leave out lots of people with the disease. We won't use the same. So there's this trade-off between sensitivity and specificity, which is what people are drawing in something called the ROC curve. So you're plotting true positives against false positives and hoping that there's quite a big area under the curve. Yeah, so this curve is used to express the relationship between sensitivity and specificity as you move the test positivity between different parameters. Is that clear enough to people? What's going on? These drawings are from an article from the 1980s that was introducing the ROC curve to medical relations. I mean, this is something you can do to evaluate tests. You don't need to take static sensitivity because what's intriguing about it is how they've drawn these curves. So they represent, say, 3 different disease populations. So this one would be like a hospitalized population, hence the prevalence is very similar. So you've got 50% prevalence of the disease. And this one, say, is an asymptomatic population, the general population. Yeah. What's intriguing about this, I think, is that the asymptomatic population and the hospitalized population have the same mean in this drawing. Just think about that for a second. If you've got diabetes to such an extent that you're symptomatic and hospitalized, wouldn't you expect this to be a lot higher than the asymptomatic population? I think it would be very strange to expect these people to have the same mean as these people, and yet that's what's being drawn. Yeah. So they're saying that whichever population you're in, the mean of the disease group will be the same, and the standard deviation will be the same in the distribution of the set shape, which I think is pretty important and it's intriguing that there. That has a consequence. So if we take this, say, 6 arbitrary units as the place where we define positivity, you'll have a sensitivity of 50% in the hospitalized population, but also in the asymptomatic general population. That's what you're expecting. The sensitivity will be the same at this level. If you go 1 standard deviation over, it'll be the same, like 5% or whatever it is. 2 standard deviations over, it'll be 95%. But wherever you put the threshold, because it's got the same mean and the same shape, you're expecting the sensitivity to be the same. So we can look at these graphs. So positive predictive value, because the areas of the graphs are different, you need 3 different lines, 1 for each curve, right? Overall accuracy, again, you need 3 different lines. The sensitivity and specificity, 1 line for sensitivity, 1 line for specificity. A consequence of assuming that they have the same mean and the same shape is that at any given threshold, the sensitivity and specificity is the same, and you can represent that relationship on a single ROC curve. You don't need multiple ROC curves. Yeah. So what I find intriguing about this is they're actually drawing their ontological intuition, which I think is pretty cool. And they're very strange intuitions. You know why are those there? They're quite odd. Okay, next one. They do wonder what happens if we skew the distribution. What happens if it's not normally distributed? But so they give this one a big tail to the right. But again, means it's the same, and it's got the same skew, which also produces sensitivity and specificity. Although the line looks different, it's still 1 line which captures all the people in the disease. Does that make sense to people? Have I explained that problem? Confused? Happy? Okay. So that, yeah. So I'm just, what was the next slide? I forget. Go on. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. So I find that really interesting that you can see the ontological intuitions that are being drawn, and they're influencing how they're interpreting and carrying out these evaluations. And there's this long tradition of medicine saying the sensitivity is specific. It's quite a confusing intuition, but it doesn't seem right at all. In recent years, people are recognizing the heterogeneity of patients more, and they're coming up with interesting concepts to try and sort this problem out. And one of the concepts they're coming up with is the so-called target condition. So instead of saying, I'm going to see how accurately the test detects patients with this disease, they're now saying, how accurately does the test detect patients with this target condition? The target condition isn't necessarily a disease. It could be, say, symptomatic people with COVID-19 who would benefit from treatment with dexamethasone, or African-American men who have a form of prostate cancer that will cause morbidity, or people presenting to hospital 2 hours ago with chest pain who do not have a particular sign on the ECG, the ST segment elevation, who have normal levels of cardiac troponins at presentation. That's not the people with myocardial infarction. Yeah, it's not the people with prostate cancer. It's much more particular groups of people that are interested in particular contexts. And they're starting to do this with target conditions, which I think is an interesting conceptual innovation. So that's me, I don't think. Yeah.
It is. Yeah, so that was already a lot, and I hope you're all still with us. We can understand it is difficult to grasp immediately, but we hope that you already see some connections with pragmatism. In all three cases, the problematic situation can be considered to be the result of underlying assumptions. And by changing our understanding of the concept that is at stake, we create a new opportunity to deal with the problem. I will now talk a bit about two frameworks we use to analyze these kinds of problems. So one is that of Ludwig Fleck's comparative epistemology, and we use it to analyze how we have arrived at certain concepts and to explain how they have affected our practices and vice versa. And a second framework that we use is conceptual engineering to make sense of the changes that are made to concepts and to evaluate their adequacy. First, Ludwig Fleck, he was an immunologist, sorry, hard to pronounce, and a philosopher of science who lived from 1896 to 1961. His work is relatively unknown, but we do witness a small rebirth of his work in STS and philosophy of science literature right now. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go in detail about his life and academic work, so I'll just focus on how we use Fleck's framework for our pragmatic purposes today. According to Fleck, cognition, so how we think and perceive of the world, is a social fact. It does not make sense to talk about an isolated observation made by an individual investigator, as thinking is the product of a collective activity, he says, a thought collective. And Fleck defines this thought collective as a community of persons that mutually exchange ideas or maintain intellectual interaction, right? So the thought collective brings forth a particular thought style, and an observation is therefore always made in a particular thought style and within a particular thought collective. To explain the production of facts within these systems, so medical facts in our case, Fleck distinguishes between what he calls active and passive elements of knowledge. Active elements are assumptions or beliefs that are actively made about the nature of the phenomenon that is being researched. Importantly, active elements are usually not determined by empirical observations, though they may be influenced by them. They are encultured choices that are historically contingent. The more active elements are in play, the more researchers are constrained by this. While active elements are actively or freely chosen, passive elements must consequently follow and are thus beyond the control of researchers. And with freely, Fleck does not mean that they are just choices that are up to or that are consciously decided upon. Rather, they must be viewed as, well, decisions, historically contingent decisions that could have been made differently, purely logically speaking. Importantly, the network of active elements, the way we conceptualize, will produce passive elements that result in resistance. So In other words, we can have empirical or clinical observations that are in straight contradiction of how the concept is currently understood. And if there's sufficient amount of resistance, active elements may be changed. And by changing the active elements of knowledge, so for example, how we define or classify a disease, a result is that our passive elements must also change. It enables us to make a different observation, or for example, to make different choices regarding the treatment. So, well, sorry, things is not working. So, while FLEC is great for analyzing how concepts have changed throughout time, it does say little about how we can analyze concepts from a forward-looking approach, right? How to evaluate how good a concept is re-engineered. How to evaluate the adequacy of newly engineered or re-engineered concepts. Well, in recent years, the field of analytic philosophy has welcomed conceptual engineering as a new meta-semantical theory and or philosophical methodology that focuses on this analysis and assessment. Engineering projects typically involve evaluative questions on which concept is best suited for a particular purpose. And the motivation behind conceptual engineering projects is mostly twofold. So one, our concepts are not necessarily perfect and may benefit from improvements. And two, these improvements cannot be made via a descriptive task of conceptual analysis, the thing we have been doing so long. So concepts are understood as normatively construed and thus as culturally and historically contingent. And an important feature of conceptual engineering is that they also allow for a plurality of conceptions to exist. Well, due to this plurality of aims and goals of these various engineering projects, it is believed that these concepts cannot be assessed by just one particular method or single set of criteria. While adjusted forms of Carnapian explication and Sally Haslanger's ameliorative analysis are sometimes used, it is also allowed to use very different assessments. They may also do the trick. However, the most important thing to remember here is that concepts, re-engineered concepts, should be assessed in terms of how well they perform the function they are designed for. So by combining these two frameworks, the Fleckian framework to analyze the history of the concept, to analyze what kind of effects are produced, and conceptual engineering or forward-looking approach, we have now two conceptual tools to analyze these issues in medicine. And we think that is much in line with pragmatism. By using these frameworks, we can't make universal statements about the larger concepts of health and disease, but we are now in a better position to make more specific contextual statements. The pragmatist position requires a more active participation for philosophers. It's not enough just to analyze and describe. We must try to actively engage with problematic situations and to develop tools that could improve medicine. So hopefully this also gives you a bit more background to analyze the case studies, because we have still some case studies we would like to share with you. So some more food for thought.
So I'll try to do this from over here. So yeah, the microphone can pick it up. Right. So first of all, this I think connects with the question about osteoporosis from earlier. This is a risk prediction tool called FRAX, which has been developed in order to incorporate more factors than simply bone mineral density into a tool which can be used to predict the risk of fracture. So instead of simply looking at bone mineral density and seeing how atypical or atypical you are, it also incorporates much other information, particularly your age, sex, weight, height, whether you've had a previous fracture, whether your parents had a previous hip fracture, whether you're smoking, whether you're on glucocorticoids, whether you've got rheumatoid arthritis, how much you drink. And these factors are incorporated into a model and it's also population specific in the sense that you've got the Union Jack there. That this would be a tool for the UK, but you'd have if you put a different country in there, say Argentina, the same numbers would give you a different score, right? So this is they're tailoring the model to different national populations. This we think is maybe an extension of what we were talking about earlier, but it seems to be a pretty different concept of disease, because although it does have bone mineral density in there, it's not in there because it's a functional parameter, right? It's in there just because it's one of many risk factors which you use to help you predict an outcome, a negative outcome. Yeah, so the how you're conceptualizing this information, I think, is very different. I think it's very much in line with what Elodie Giroux is working on at the moment in her current work, as this is a risk predicting as a health and disease concept, which perhaps shouldn't be referred to as disease at all. Although some people in the osteoporosis literature do say that this provides information about disease status. So we think this is it's just a different concept, maybe the extension of what we were talking about earlier, just focusing on the pragmatic concern of predicting risk. So that's I think another kind of concept. Another instance would be what these people in this literature in the blue box are referring to as personalized reference intervals. So standard approach would be maybe, again, familiar from philosophy of medicine, is reference data is provided from a population, and patients are considered as members of the population rather than as individuals. So you compare someone's test result to the average result of some population or other, and that's how you determine whether or not they're typical or atypical. What these people are suggesting is you can compare an individual's result to their own standard, yeah, which they say they can set by some other means, and it's happening if not just isolated people suggesting this. So what they're suggesting is for certain parameters you can have homeostatic set points. So you're not normal for a population and pathological. So it's it's this really. So you take, say, my result, my blood test result, and you compare it to a reference population. That would be the normal way of doing things. Where what these people are suggesting is you take my result and compare it to some parameter which has been produced from earlier versions of me. You're comparing it to a younger version of me, an earlier version of me, which obviously raises questions like, why is the earlier version of me more healthy? Yeah, why is that the standard to assess me by? And how do we know which parameters have homeostatic set points? Plenty of them don't. Why? And also, why particularly for me should this parameter for me stay at some constant level that I can compare it to? But still, it's worth highlighting as it is a different concept which is being designed to address problems. For instance, I think one of the titles here is personalized reference intervals for platelet count reduce the number of subjects with unexplained thrombocytopenia. So by using personalized platelet counts, it changes which people are considered to be diseased and not diseased. Yeah. So I think it's a different concept. It's interesting to look at. Also to note, this idea is not necessarily a new one, and they recognize this. So historically, physicians using a kind of inductive reasoning approach paid more attention to individuals. More recently, the approach has changed from focusing on the individual to focus on the average characteristics. Now, these people in this paper are referring to thought and behavior from the middle of the 20th century, but I think it's maybe even better to compare it to behavior in the middle of the century beforehand. So we have historians like John Hardy Warner, who's drawn attention to this shift from people talking about what's natural for them to what's normal for a population, right? So people used to say, I'm urinating more than is natural for me. Yeah, but then by the end of the 1800s, people started talking about, well, I'm urinating more than is normal for a population. Yeah, so there's a shift in thinking that Warner identified, and perhaps this is a picking up on those themes from the middle of the 1800s, but at least returning to a similar concept. Anyway, it's a different concept. It's worth considering. It has interesting ramifications. A couple more, almost there, chaps, promise. So polycystic ovarian syndrome, I think there's a nice little technology that's come out of this literature. So there are several definitions of polycystic ovarian syndrome. The National Institute of Health in America recommended one in 1990. So you need both hyperandrogenism and ovarian dysfunction, both together to be considered polycystic ovarian syndrome. That's intriguing because that means you don't need polycystic ovaries to have polycystic ovarian syndrome. And because this was these people were more concerned with like metabolic consequences of this issue. So whether you develop insulin resistance or whether you have cardiovascular problems, Those are the things they're trying to predict, whereas other people were more interested in exploring reproductive function, and they wanted to focus on whether you had polycystic ovaries or not. So Rotterdam criteria from 2003 required 2 of 3, so hyperandrogenism and ovulatory dysfunction or polycystic ovaries. So you could have now polycystic ovarian syndrome without, for instance, hyperandrogenism. Some people, I think this is the American Endocrine Society, thought that's pushing it a bit far. We're happy for people to have either polycystic ovarian morphology or ovulatory dysfunction, but you do have to have hyperandrogenism for them. So you have all these different, what people call phenotypes being produced, effectively different intersections of Venn diagrams of these different problems. Yeah, so the NIH says it's just people in here, those have polycystic ovarian syndrome, whereas Rotterdam came along and said, well, it could be anybody in here, that's fine. And then the American Endocrine Society said, it's got to be in here somewhere, but not that. Yeah. And they're having an argument about which is the best way to define the syndrome. Some people came along and suggested what they call two-state solution. So in effect, people with phenotypes A and B there, you need to give that a new name. That's the NIH definition. They should stop calling that polycystic ovarian syndrome and call it something else. And you should call C and D polycystic ovarian syndrome. So thus dividing the interesting phenotypes into 2 territories. But this wasn't desperately popular as an approach because there's that intersection in the middle, right, which everyone wanted. Yeah, so no one was willing to give up that territory. So instead, they've come up with, I think, this is the interesting conceptual innovation from my point of view. Now researchers would say, I'm studying polycystic ovarian syndrome phenotypes A, C, and D. Yeah. So that's what they start doing instead of arguing about how do we divide the territory into perfect categories. We just specify more, we leave them all together, but specify more closely which phenotypes we're talking about, which I think is, again, a nice conceptual innovation. And the final one in the last couple of minutes, classification of diabetes. So everyone will know, traditionally divided into type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes being young onset thin patients with an autoimmune etiology, and type 2 diabetes being adult onset overweight patients with insulin resistance. But this runs into problems such as you have people who have signs of autoimmunity, but also signs of insulin resistance. Yeah, so simultaneously, and this is particularly referred to as latent autoimmune diabetes of adulthood, or some people refer to that as type 1.5 diabetes. So there's a heterogeneity within the categories, which so people can't fit into the categories. So that's the problem. One potential solution to the problem is that you would subdivide type 1 into, say, type 1, type A, B, C, or D, and type 2 into types A, B, C, and D, and specify more closely. So this is like a precision medicine approach, perhaps, specifying more closely the subcategories that you mean. But this, according to at least one researcher, is still maintaining what he calls a pigeonhole model. So instead of having big pigeonholes, you just cut the pigeonholes into smaller groups. And this person suggests perhaps you want to adopt what they refer to as a palette model. So instead of thinking about which pigeonhole you fit into, now you think of an individual's disease status, their color, being a function of which, so like you could make a slightly more purpley blue, but using a little bit of red and make it slightly more green by putting a bit of yellow in there. You have an individual's disease status as a composite of sort of a position in a multidimensional matrix. And that's the concept he's trying to put forward. Which refers to as a palette model. So yeah, this is how they draw it in this diagram. So you have these diabetic component pathways, which you can have more or less of, producing a sort of unique signature for each person, rather than typing people into distinct categories. And again, just a final thought, which I think is quite fun, that bears some resemblance to humoral theories. It's not a perfect match, but in humoral theories of disease, your disease status is a function of your particular combination of these different fluids, the spore, whereas there's many more diabetes component pathways. And it is diabetes component pathways, right? This is how you type people within the category of diabetes. Because these component pathways don't apply to every disease. So there's a lot of differences, but it's still something like your position in a multidimensional matrix, which is what is important. So that's just a quick fire of, these are the kinds of things we go looking for as people encountering problems, trying to develop conceptual solutions which help them solve their problems. What we want to do is put them into a toolbox and think, how do we use them to solve other problems as well? That's roughly what we're about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if a PowerPoint presentation could be diagnosed as diagnosed with ADHD, it was a lot, but hopefully the message is clear indeed. Like Nick said, we think there's something very important to look at, to look at medical literature and to look at medical practice and depart from that instead of starting with a theoretical debate on these very abstract big notions of health and disease. We think this is more interesting and can provide very important insights also for the theoretical debate. So thank you all.
Thank you both so much. There's, I think, a lot of food for thought. I think we should get on with the discussion, but let's have like 30 seconds to a minute to just collect thoughts very quickly. And then we'll start with questions in the room, and then I'll come to online. For those online, you can either type your question and then I can either read them out, or everyone can read them themselves. Or if you raise your hand and you have decent audio, please do, and then we can unmute you and we should be able to hear you in the room. So yeah, I'll be back in 1 minute. Okay, that was about a minute. So let's start with questions. I don't know if there's any questions in the room to start with. I'm sure there are. I apologize for everyone in the room has to come to the seat.
Just somewhere near the microphone.
Okay. I have one question, because you're clearly against, say, general disease and illness concepts, but where are disease and illness concepts not used for social reasons? Namely, like who is entitled to benefits, and who shouldn't go to jail if they commit a crime. So are you not, are you not just say ignoring those issues, and it's that not the reason why you are not in favor of, say, a general disease or illness concept?
I can ignore you can what you want.
Well,
I'm happy.
yeah, go
Thank you
ahead,
very
Nick.
much.
Go ahead.
You're right, we haven't given you examples of such problems. We could, and those problems certainly exist. I guess our response would be, maybe even in those contexts, a general account won't be optimal either. Say in the questions of criminal court, what are you trying to find out with the diagnosis? Maybe you're trying to find out, is this person culpable? Are they responsible for their behavior? And maybe that question is a different question to what treatment do they need in a clinic. That would be the kind of thing you wanted to look at and explore. So I think maybe even in those contexts, one size isn't going to fit all. So I think in those particular courtroom contexts, you want to ask questions, what are you really doing with the disease concept? What questions are you trying to answer? And I'm suspicious that a general concept wouldn't provide such answers. But you need to be very particular. We need to get into particular case studies if we haven't prepared. But it'd be great to talk about it. You have a particular case study where you think a general concept would apply well. That'd be very interesting.
Great, I think Helena, or let's start with Helena and then yeah, they're very odd chairs.
Just stand up with parents.
Okay, sorry. Right, so I have a sort of question comment thing that I would like you to just think about. I really like this very sort of practice engaged way of thinking about concepts of health and disease, but I'm a bit puzzled about the sort of what's the method and what's the outcome. So it seems to me that you're suggesting that by looking closely at these cases, you want to articulate certain concepts of health and disease that can then help us make more philosophical sense of what is health and what is disease. Maybe we don't want a single concept, but we want sort of a broad notion of or plural notion of diseases and healthy is, I don't know if that would be in plural. But in your presentation, so I think that's very exciting, and I would like to hear what sort of, if you could specify what different concepts of disease you could come up with from these cases, because I think in the cases, it seems to me that the pragmatic exploration of concepts of health and disease It's more a method to make sense of a problem. So you say there is a problem in this, whatever case you're studying, and we can understand why the problem arises by pragmatically looking at what are the underlying conceptions of health and disease and how do they explain the problem that comes about. And then, yeah, so then in this case, it doesn't seem like you're actually feeding into discussions about conceptions of health and disease, but rather you're using this sort of archaeological work of digging out hidden concepts to explain other issues in philosophy of medicine. Does that mean?
So roughly, can we get back to practice?
So roughly, so are you using it as a method, pragmatic ideas of health and disease as a method to make sense of clinical cases, or are you using clinical cases to find concepts of health and disease that we can then take back to philosophy?
I think both. I think both. Thank you for that question. So I just think it is more interesting to look at medical literature, actual debates between medical researchers, for example, in controversial conditions such as chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic pain conditions, and the type of arguments that you can see there provide you very interesting insights in the thinking of medical doctors about pain or chronic fatigue. And that can give us more insights about, well, what are medical professionals actually doing in practice? The same goes for osteoporosis. That is very different than a naturalistic, like Borsian theory, right? So we learn from practice on the one hand, and the other hand, of course, we do want to go back to theory and see how both can strengthen each other. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, so yeah, we do learn from practice, but say there are instances where, like, I think with the diagnostic testing stuff, you can go back to practice and say, in many cases, it looks like you have this concept and it doesn't look optimal. Yeah, and maybe you want to revise that in a different way, and we can start talking with people about how would you revise that to, because maybe you're revising them about the project they're engaged with, because at the moment they're assuming, well, not all of them, there's a big spectrum of views, but it's still commonplace to say this assumption of homogeneity is very commonplace, and we can go, maybe we need to find homogeneity, because otherwise you don't know how the test will behave next time you use it. But you need to be conscious that where you're going to find homogeneity and how you're going to find homogeneity is going to be pretty different in different places and for different purposes. So that, I think, is, you can start making that advice to plenty of people who evaluate tests. So it is going backwards and forwards. Yeah. Hermeneutic, it's not one way or the other. Yeah.
David, did you have a question?
Two questions. Well, a big question and a little question.
Thank you. We out of your way and get the one done.
Where's the mortgage chair?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that was great, and I really like the whole approach. Let me start with a little question, which was about the diagnostic tests and specificity and sensitivity. And I mean, this is just a matter of curiosity. You said at the beginning that you weren't concerned about base rate issues. I mean, you didn't use that term, but I took it as, because when I can imagine there's some number, either how likely it is a positive result indicates the disease, which factors in the sensitivity, whichever way around it is, and the base rate, right? And I mean, that's just a mathematical thing. Are we going to include the base rate or not in the number? I was just curious about all those people you quoted as saying that the sensitivity and specificity are to do with the test and not the population. Whether some of them mightn't just have been taking one side on that mathematical question, because it's just because it seems crazy for somebody to say that the sensitivity is a property of the test independently of how symptomatic the people are. I mean, that would seem a weird thing to say.
I understand it's a weird thing, it seems a weird thing to say, but they say it.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. So I agree with you, it's a weird thing to say, and the history of that, I've done quite a lot of work on that.
Yeah.
It's slightly, it was pretty ahistorical history going, how on earth did this become the traditional view?
Yeah.
And so it's, yeah.
I'm just curious, because seeing those quotes out of context, you think, what could they mean? They must mean something about the base rates.
Well, to convince you, I'd have to show you the quote in
Yeah, okay,
context.
I know
I'd like to, and I show you they don't.
Now I've asked, I'm convinced.
Yeah,
That's
Is
right.
it to do with in relation to the gold standard test? Is that what they're trying to say, that
Um,
depending on the gold
that
standard?
is one of the explanations for apparent variation, is if the gold standard's not right, the reference standard is sometimes incorrect. And this is the part I find confusing about that argument, it's differently incorrect in different contexts. Then even if the index test is correct, it's going to be falsely incorrect. It'll appear to be varying in how it's performing, even though it actually isn't. That is one of the explanations for apparent variation which people use. So there's a lot going on there. But it's in many cases it's not intuitive to say they wouldn't move around, and it's very hard to explain in many situations. And it is just quite odd. But I think the way to explain it is historically. You can look at how those intuitions developed historically. And that's a large part of what I do at the moment as well. I agree it's strange. Most people do recognize symptomatic, asymptomatic. Most people do recognize that. The slides I went through to say I'm not going to go through it, I could do it, but I won't. Fine. Is so that a lot of people would think, well, asymptomatic people, they're all going to be the same because they have the same severity of disease. And there are plenty of reasons to think, oh, that's not right. There are loads of factors that quite intuitively should influence how accurate a test is in different contexts, but they are traditionally ignored, which is quite worrying, frankly. And that's problem-solving problem, what we're trying to do.
Good. That's helpful. That's all right. Big question. So I like the whole approach. I mean, and I've kind of heard this. I heard this from the Worrells, John and Jennifer Worrells, saying that why are we fighting about definitions of disease? What we're interested in who should get what kinds of treatment, and if the definitions of disease don't line up with that, well, that just shows definitions of disease are not very interesting. And but there is a corollary of your approach, and I'm taking it you're going to define a target condition as, as something where these people are deserving of medical treatment, help, prevention. But then, I don't think this is an objection, but the consequence is that certain conditions will kind of move in and out of the category of this is a specific disease as time passes, just because what's deserving of medical treatment will depend on all kinds of extraneous factors like the level of resources available, social expectations, expected role of medical personnel, and so on. So fertility is an obvious case. When I was young, it wasn't a disease, and now it is, and I think that's right. But was it wrong back then? The times were different. So you don't. Does this worry you that there's no kind of objectivity to what's a
very good
a
question.
medical condition?
Yes, I am worried. I think that's also worried. In my publication on chronic pain, we describe this history, how this classification was changed. And if you look in the medical literature in the task force installed by the WHO, you can really see that the core reasons that were used were not so much about new insights about pain. So this new, more multidimensional theory was already there, but it were actually very practical. And with practical, I mean purposes to, if we can classify it as a disease, it becomes easier to reimburse treatments, to direct more research funding. All these types of arguments were also mentioned. Now, I don't think that is, this is also why disease and health are practical concepts, right? Because they are linked with so many institutional social arrangements we got. Now you can question if we should cut them loose, but that's another question. So yes, they are linked, but I don't think you have to be careful there, because I don't think it is enough to say, well, these were the reasons that we can see in the medical literature. So that's not enough for a pragmatist position, right? We really need to balance the pros and cons And that's why it is hard to make a universal definition of what is health or what is disease. We'll come back to this discussion for cases.
But I don't think this is an objection. I think the fact that things count as diseases, I mean, disease almost falls out of your story. They count as conditions deserving as treatment. The fact that which conditions are so deserving of treatment, that it varies over time, I don't think is an objection. It's just what one would expect. I'm not sure the chronic pain case is a case of this. I mean, I took it from what you were saying, that your view was that the medical classifications were wrong not to consider it as an ailment deserving of treatment. That now, I mean,
yeah,
when they weren't treating it, it wasn't due to resources. It wasn't just due to changing social mores. It was just a mistake. They should have been treating it when they weren't. So that's not one of the cases I'm thinking about. But with infertility, was it wrong not to treat infertility in the 1960s?
I mean, the point would be, if you have to, in order to answer the question, like, is it a disease, you need to have a conversation about, well, what's a problem and what are we trying to do about it?
Right.
It involves such questions.
Yeah.
And you to try and do the biological stuff first.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, even I think the thing that the chronic pain example makes very nicely is the biological account of what is happening itself is pretty contingent. Yeah, and pragmatically oriented, and it's quite a radical position to take. But we shouldn't be trying to pretend that we can isolate these factors from each other, and we don't have to worry about a collapse into sort of a madness of anything you believe is.
No, I wasn't suggesting.
Yeah, if we're worried about questions of objectivity, that's usually why.
No, I wanted to say I don't think this is an objection. I mean, I think the lack of objectivity is a good thing. I don't know. Yeah.
We agree.
Yeah.
One quick response to your comment on what I said and what I said earlier on pain, because your observation is absolutely right. What I meant to say, I do think it was a fault not to view chronic pain as a disease, but because of this conceptual story, which goes beyond the reasons that have been proposed in the medical literature, we're now viewing it as a disease. So for different purposes, I think it should. Yeah.
I'm just going to, from my own question share, where I think everyone can hear me speak loudly, read out some of the comments and questions in the chat box. So firstly, Phelan Murphy, so sorry if I pronounced that wrong. It's just a comment, says excellent approach to disease, especially in this world where AI is being used to develop care, treatment pathways for disease based on the potentially flawed concepts of health and disease. If we don't understand what disease is, we will continue to over and undertreat based on flawed algorithms. That's one kind of offshoot and comment view. And then there's two questions. I'll read the first out and you can address it, and then the second. The first is from Lucy Yano. How would something like prenatal genetic testing fit into a pragmatist approach?
Prenatal genetic testing. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to find abnormalities before patients fall. And you have to, I guess the pragmatic approach would be, why are we concerned about such an abnormality? So maybe take someone with Down syndrome. There's quite a spectrum of people with Down syndrome. So it's not enough to say that they have Down syndrome and that's the thing you're trying to detect. You have to try and worry, well, what kind of Down syndrome, what sort of person are they going to be? Are they going to be like severely handicapped or not? And does that severe handicap inform a parent's decision about whether to continue with the pregnancy? And all of those questions are involved. They're involved anyway, right? But if the issue is we're classifying the patient as having Down syndrome or something like this, then you need to. It's not enough just to say that's the objective condition that they've got. You have to worry, well, why do you care? And then when you start worrying about why do you care, then you start worrying about, well, what sort of a Down syndrome is this child going to be, and can we tell? Right, and so because the category Down syndrome is such a heterogeneous category, I don't think the simple categorization would be enough. I don't know if that's the kind of answer that they're looking for. That's what I come up with on the top of my head.
Great. Okay, and then there's another question from Jim O'Brien, which follows on, I think, from David's first small question, which is just, isn't base rate most important in the positive or negative predictive value of a test? predicting or not predicting disease, sensitivity and specificity, assume we know the presence or absence of disease.
Isn't base rate most important? Gosh, there's lots of ways to answer that. I'm going to try this way. Even if you know whether or not the condition is present, this is not something I've talked about, but it's another problem with the approach, is we're very focused, like the vast bulk of the literature on evaluating a test is focused on accuracy and indices like sensitivity and specificity. We can wonder about why, because just knowing the presence of a condition such as Down syndrome from a moment ago, what is that telling us? Yeah, it's not necessarily telling us the things that we want to know. I think one of the target conditions I had on there was patients with COVID-19 infection who were symptomatic and would benefit from dexamethasone therapy. There's quite a lot of patients with COVID-19 disease don't, right? Although you're producing similar symptoms, that's my understanding. I've never treated anyone with COVID-19 infection, but my understanding is some people benefit and some people don't, because sometimes the virus causes collapse of your immune system. Dexamethasone is not a good idea, and sometimes it just causes a hyperactive immune system, in which case dexamethasone is a good idea. And just detecting the category doesn't tell you that. So this focus on accuracy isn't necessarily telling you the things that you want to know, right? So is base rate most important? Well, that'll depend. Sometimes there's really big variations in sensitivity and specificity in populations that have a similar base rate, in which case the variation in sensitivity and specificity is most important to determining accuracy, then maybe accuracy isn't the thing you should be concerned about anyway. So it's just these assumptions of homogeneity really cause problems. Yeah, so that's the thing I'm trying to highlight.
Great. So that's all for the online questions. Were there more questions in the room? Yeah.
Just wanted to say thank you for a really interesting talk. I'm quite new to this topic, so forgive me if this is a bit of a silly question. I wanted to ask about self-diagnosis and how that ties into your approach, and also in terms of outcomes and practical applications. How do you do that in a sort of globalist world? Very pharma influenced. Sort of this is the treatment for this disease for everybody. And then lastly, just what's next in terms of you for research? Are you going to be looking at other conditions to apply this model to? And yeah, thank you.
Could you maybe first explain a bit more about what you mean by self-diagnosis, or what the question is?
Like, how does that play into the pragmatic approach in terms of, like, for example, there are certain conditions where people are more likely to self-identify with. So, for example, like chronic pain, or with mental health, or with autism, and people saying, "Oh, I actually don't have a disease. This is just who I am as an individual." How does that play into it? And the opposite side of like medical specialists and like doctors saying, "You have this."
Right. Oh, good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now go if you want. I don't know if I'm just talking too much.
Yeah, I can just quickly comment on that. And my first thoughts are, well, the pragmatic approach is not only in the direction of including more things because they have all kinds of clinical or social practical utility, it also goes the other way around, of course. So it's not that now that boundaries are completely gone, right? Chronic pain or other types of conditions that maybe are more prone to be self-diagnosed, we of course want our suffering to be explained through the medical lens. Of course, this is also where some of the problems come from. So there's no easy answer to this, I would say, but only that pragmatism goes both ways. So, and it is this continuously balancing between medicalizing on the one hand and normalizing on the other. We can probably do a better job. I don't think so. No?
I have spoken to clinicians who have expressed their regret on occasion, for example, of not allocating a patient to a disease category because they didn't fit some criteria. But they have that regret because they think that their membership of that category and the social connection with other patients with that condition would have benefited that patient. You know, so that would be, I think, an example of balancing different factors, which on this approach you would need to balance. You know, rather than going, the biology is X, so go, and you don't have the biology, so you don't belong in the category, even if it would help you in something. So I can see space for that. But you also have to worry, because if being a member of that category also triggers interventions which are suited to that biology, you now need to be more flexible. You can't just go in the bucket and stay in the bucket for all purposes. So you need to worry about the consequences of going in the bucket as well. Is that an answer?
The other question was regarding, our pragmatist position in a globalist world. Sure, if I
Well, I think that the diagnostic testing for TB is directly speaks to that. And maybe even self-diagnosis of people using these kits at home. I don't think they were, but they in this world of COVID people did. Certainly every time I flew from Holland to the UK, they didn't do much because of all quarantines, but you were required at various stages by the British government to go get a test with a certain sensitivity and specificity. And that's all they said. They didn't say for what, in whom. And that's now information because you're responsible for that as a traveller. That's something that the public needs to understand, not just the doctors. It's problems are spreading.
maybe small addition. So I'm also trained in clinical psychology, and there are some disorders, or actually quite a lot, that are the assessment of them with psychometric tests. The cutoff points or the interpretation of them differ between cultures or countries, and I think that's also wonderful, right? So it's not like the disorder is everywhere the same, and because of like cultural influences on how we behave or on our personality are different. We also assess disorders differently. That's interesting. Same goes, I mentioned ADHD. So great work by Professor Singh of Oxford showed that children in the UK with ADHD are more viewed as having a behavioral disorder. So they need to take the medication to sit still in class and but also beyond class, right? So they will also take medication in the weekends. Whereas in the US, it is really viewed ADHD as a performance thing. So children would normally only use medication in class, but not in weekends and not on holidays. So again, different, same disorder, different interpretations. So, and I think that is something also to cherish. You should be aware of this and also question this. Why is it different? But yeah, it has also benefits.
Great, thank you. There was another question in the room, but I think we should close up and perhaps that person can ask after. Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you most to Nick and Rik. Yeah, the details of our next event are in the chat, so please do have a look and come along either in person or online if you're able. For those in the room, we're now going to the India Club for some food and a drink. Anyone is welcome. And for those online, if any of you are near the India Club on the Strand, please come along.
No pizza.
No, sadly no disease pizzas, but thanks so much everyone.